Thank you for that lovely introduction. Hi, my name is Afaina. I'm based in Amsterdam. And yeah, what a big word, precarity. It's quite interesting. I never used the word, but starting to think about the theme, I guess it's kind of interwoven through my practice. Well, you know, being born and raised in Amsterdam is also a very particular experience. This is basically on my way to school when I was young. I grew up in the kind of, you know, early 80s, late 70s, when Amsterdam was really a city of squatters. There was a lot of protest. It was filled with artists. There was a lot of space to experiment, and I really kind of grew up within these spaces. Within counterculture. Later, you know, it was my parents were into punk. They were also artists, architects, hip hop, graffiti, and in a way, you know, growing up in this setting where there was precarity in housing, there was a lot of like violence in the sense of racist violence. You kind of have to be street smart. So when I went to architecture school, I kind of always felt that I was representing from this reality, right? I always wanted to kind of design for the people I grew up with, or the neighborhoods I grew up with, or the kind of countercultures I was part of. And I think, you know, like Amsterdam, of course, all cities have changed a lot. But in that sense, I think Amsterdam is still a city of enormous precarity. There's still not that much artist spaces. We're still dealing with housing precarities and you know, racist violence, gender violence, etc. So I would say, you know, like this whole word of precarity is kind of an inherent undercurrent in how I develop my practice. You know, I can't enter most spaces in a kind of obvious way. And going to architecture school, I was also kind of shocked how narrow, you know, the field of knowledge was that we were kind of learning. And so I kind of started my practice in industrial reuse, which I also found very narrow, right? So, you know, in the 17 years, 20 years I've been practicing, I kind of found this space of freedom to experiment within kind of on this boundary of art and architecture. And I'm very much active kind of, I don't know, in my own world, I feel. So I will just share a little bit of my thought process and two projects, and I hope I'm fast enough to do this in this time. So when I started my practice, you know, it wasn't crystallized in that sense. I just felt like I worked in this international architecture office, and we were doing like 100-hour weeks, and I just felt like this is really not for me. You know, I do not think that this is the way I want to do architecture. I'm interested in writing, I'm interested in making videos, I'm interested in people, in culture, in making space. And so I kind of went on that path to develop my own practice. I think one of the things, like Flora also mentioned, that I was very much interested in was, you know, like how do you create kind of a formal language that can kind of capture all of these diasporic spaces, you know, and all these kind of complex identities that now inhabit the city. And I guess that has been something I've been experimenting a lot with. And all of the projects that I had, there was always never enough budget, right? So I think from that also came the punk or the kind of counterculture mentality that we had to make something out of nothing, right? So I think also through my work in the beginning, you will see kind of a lack of materiality. And really one of the things that I kind of resulted to was graphics. Like I inhabit this visual world, and you know, some of my early work, I made the space and then we didn't have any money. But, you know, I don't like kind of these wide, rough spaces. So I started painting and doing graphics myself. And over time that kind of has elaborated into this graphic language. And I really see it as something that grew out of a limited budget, but also that is a form of kind of contemporary ornament. Sorry, wrong button. Yeah, so this is basically, I'll just walk you through it. So these are some of the projects that can maybe illustrate a little bit what I'm trying to do in finding not only a kind of a spatial language, a spatial way to deal with these kind of complex identities or diasporic identities that I know. And at the same time also incorporating these kind of graphics as an ornamental thing. So this is a spatial installation we did in Rotterdam a few years back. It's completely made out of cardboard. I put it together myself, so it's like really one-on-one modeling. I use a lot of like paper modeling to kind of try out my ideas. And really kind of the art world has kind of afforded me the chance to, you know, experiment and try out some of these spaces. So this was a project that we did for the Storefront for Art and Architecture about contemporary souvenirs and kind of like how do you capture the value of a specific place. In this case, it was Brownsville in Brooklyn. So we went there and kind of, you know, found out what were the essential spaces to that community. And most of those spaces were kind of, you know, it could be like a small arch on the gateway to the park or like murals, and kind of out of these spaces we reconstructed this idea for a space in which people could have music, come together, but also that is kind of a graphic, you know, I don't know, a graphic thing that carries kind of meaning, you know, and kind of relates to that collective memory of that place. I also do a lot of exhibition design, and I think really my fascination in exhibition design comes that as a kid, I always went to these art spaces, and I just hated the kind of whiteness of it, the sort of forced neutrality. So I always kind of tried to play with scale, to play with color, and to kind of create new spaces within these art spaces that people can kind of appropriate, and also kind of, yeah, it allows me also to experiment with what is the human scale? How do you create spaces that can embrace people? And again, these are, you know, exhibition designs with very limited budgets. I want people to be able to touch it. And at the same time, when I'm talking to museums, I also kind of always try to make little jokes. Well, to me, they're not a joke, but I kind of grew up in architecture school with always like the same kind of suburban middle-class white families in the renders. So I'm now just consistently putting in my aunties and my cousins and everyone I know, and just to put it out there also that, yeah, so like museums always say that they want like a diverse demographic, but what does that actually look like, right? So if I put it in the render, like, and it's always kind of this, oh yeah, I hope this would really happen, and it's like, yeah, okay, so we need to talk about that. But yeah, so yeah, as I was saying, whoa, sorry, it's a little bit intense. So over time, I kind of developed this interdisciplinary practice, you know, and I think this it has been informed not only by kind of architectural thinking, but also by musicians, by Public Enemy, by Saul Williams, by feminist thinkers like Bell Hooks, by Sarah Ahmed, and many, 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 many others. And I think out of that, then at a certain point, you have to realize that the knowledge that we're working with is quite limited. And that kind of forced me to also make that more explicit, that I want to engage in a kind of feminist practice. What it exactly means, I don't know. But I think I would like my projects to encourage change, you know, in some way. And that is also something that I really use when I'm saying yes or no to a project. You know, can this spatial issue, or can we kind of accommodate difference through the design? Yeah, so I do like a podcast. It's a spatial feminist podcast, and we basically read books and talk to the authors. It's all online. Check it out. It's very nice. Well, and then, you know, I think it's also something that is that we need in the schools, right? So this is a fanzine I'm making with well, my students at the TU Wien and KTH. And we're basically reading Audre Lorde, Sister Outsider, which is, you know, pretty far out in terms of literature. But if you apply it actually to our practice, it's quite interesting what comes up. And I think, you know, thoughts or theories like the margin, what happens when we take the margin as the center is something that's very crucial for architecture, where we have been designing in a way where kind of universal man is, you know, or a modular man, you know, is this person that we design for, which is actually a pretty specific person, right? It's kind of a man, he's 180, I don't know, he probably has a wife, I don't know. But what if you do take the margin? It's so interesting when having these conversations with students, it's like, yeah, but if we're going to design for like a person of color in a wheelchair who's transgender, that's so complicated. And it's like, no, you know, it's actually like, if we could capture that, then everyone can use this space, right? So I think these are just little things, or major things actually, that we have to start also applying in education. This is a pavilion that's being built right now in Stockholm. And it's basically, for a year, I went to Stockholm and I spoke with did like all these graphic workshops with different groups of women. Also because I wanted to design the building from the perspective of how do women in this city there, you know, how do they go about public space? What experiences do they have? What does this building, this public building, have to be enable for them to, first of all, feel safe, but second of all, feel like it's actually theirs? And I think that was a whole journey. And for me, even one of the things that super annoyed me while making the models was that the only female models I could find, like the little puppetjes, the little model people, were like these really annoying little ladies, and they were all sitting like this. So out of that, really, with the people that I have been working with in Stockholm, we body scanned everyone. We invited the whole city to body scan. And we made like all of these new scale figures. So now I'm very happy because I have like 200 new scale figures, and I hope to will share them with you soon. So just some illustrations from the things I'm doing. But yeah, so last year I was part of the Dutch contribution at the Venice Biennale, which I would like to share something with you. So my contribution was called The Multiplicity of Other. And the idea behind it was basically to identify kind of the spatial knowledge of all these groups, well, basically the majority of othered groups, as fundamental for us to be able to design for all these complex cities in the 21st century, right? So have in mind that we're kind of designing from this very single-minded, universal perspective. So it was basically a spatial installation that was meant to be a performance space, but of course, because of COVID, we couldn't do performances. Which was kind of annoying. So I invited different speakers, thinkers, practitioners, artists, singers, musicians, and we basically kind of explored together what this multiplicity of other could mean to architecture. And this is maybe the manifesto, maybe quickly. Yeah, so I mean, I see I only have 1 more minute, so I think I have to speed it up. I think this is really essential for me in my practice, that, and also as part of the multiplicity of other, that we have to kind of realize that we're using this very specific, narrow-minded, narrow, singular perspective, right? But that spatial practice is happening all around us. And I really love seeing all these kind of spatial cultural practices and kind of incorporate them into the thinking of architecture. And I think in that sense, to do that, we also have to question our ideas, you know, of tabula rasa, for instance. I mean, you know, Le Corbusier's plan for Addis Abeba was, I mean, it was for a city that already existed centuries, right? Or ideas of the void. You know, I think also how we teach, we're not going to go to the site. It's not like an empty container that we can fill. You know, it's not. The site is actually a subject. but also the architectural gaze. From what perspective are we looking? And I think in that sense, feminist theory is great because it gives us like an intersectional framework, but also kind of has us to reconsider where we stand if we look at kind of ecological disaster upon us, etc. So this is just some, this is the space. I wanted to make a space that was kind of the opposite of this kind of white, rational, clean, beautiful modernist building. So it was light, it was floaty, you kind of had to wander through it. Sometimes you could see, sometimes you couldn't, and in that you would find these different video installations, different conversations, different performances, kind of going through, yeah, how can we kind of look at these things different? How can we move other? If you go to the website, there are like these 9 wonderful interviews. And another part of the contribution was this new canon that I made together with Deborah Solomon. And it's basically a canon of women, many of who are Black or queer, indigenous activists, and kind of have an indirect spatial background. And I think our idea was that, we have an architectural canon, but why is it so limited? Like, we should include many, many different practitioners if we want to be able to design for this age, right? So it kind of questions this very traditional, I don't know, best of men list. And we also need new words. So another part of the contribution was this glossary that I made together with Claiming Spaces Collective. Yeah, we also have to have better definition or better words to be able to communicate with each other about some of the issues that we're dealing with. And what does that look like in architecture? How can you relate it to the practice that we're actually in? So I think another project that kind of opened around the same time as the Venice Biennale was the slavery exhibition at the Rijksmuseum. And there I was basically dealing with an exhibition about 10 people who were enslaved. But how do you design an exhibition around people who don't have any power pictures with golden frames, whose lives are only documented in writing by the colonizer, right? Within a building that is actually kind of, Dutch national identity in architecture. So what I did is basically create all these new spaces within the walls of the Rijksmuseum, and within these spaces we could tell the stories of the 10 people who were enslaved. At the same time, the whole exhibition was made circular, so all the materials had already been used. Afterwards, we disassembled the whole exhibition and they went back into this kind of circular loop. Also something I think is very important. And here's just some shots. So I created all these kind of mirrored spaces. Also in the idea of, like lots of slavery and colonialism happened in these places, in these geographies far away that we couldn't see, that we weren't aware of, that still aren't a place in our mind. So I wanted to play with kind of spaces that were there but weren't there. What you can see, what you can't see. And I think that's kind of a common thread in my work. This is really one of the last rooms. Also kind of, the beads are all these stones that were money on the Dutch plantations. And after slavery, people threw them in the ocean. And they still wash up on the shores. So we assembled them like that. And in the middle is basically this sword that one of the enslaved women who was a Maroon and a freedom fighter used in her battles against the Dutch on the Dutch Antilles Islands. And behind it you have like all these Surinamese women who were part of the Dutch exhibition, so one of the human zoos on the Museumplein. And within the tableau you find like the manumissions, or like when the Dutch gave freedom to the Surinamese and the Dutch Antilles. So it's kind of also this assemblage or juxtapositions of all these different elements that relate to freedom, and kind of also questioning this whole idea of freedom. And that's it. Thank you.